Why don't you? Why don't you?
何々したらどうですかという意味ですね。英語の聞き取りは、ベーシックな発音では聞き取れるのに、ネイティブが普通に喋ると聞き取れないという話をよく聞きます。それは私たち日本人が予測して待っている英語と実際に聞こえてくる英語が違う音だからです。なので、教科書通りのベーシックな発音を抑えた上で、実際のネイティブの言い方に慣れる必要があります。それではネイティブがどのように発音しているかを確認しましょう。
Why don't you hawk some of your jewelry?
Well, she shouldn't have, so why don't you find your way out?
Why don't you read my beads?
Then why don't you come and try?
Which is a nice way of telling you, why don't you put some curtains on your bedroom window?
Why don't you sit down and join us?
Why don't you take her to her father's house?
Why don't you guys go get portraits done by a professional photographer? Until then, General Grant, why don't you set up camp? Right there.
Why don't you kiss me now, Lorenzo?
Susan, if you're not sure what she meant by it, why don't you just have a talk with her?
Why don't you make me?
Why don't you two come?
Totally.
Why don't you give these out to some of the boys in lieu of pay?
Why don't you run upstairs and grab some bandages out of the bathroom?
But just for now, why don't you try on some positivity, eh?
Why don't you just get out of here?
Why don't you sit down and relax?
Rich, why don't you just ask him for the money?
Why don't you go and take a vacation?
Why don't you go down to the clinic and see that nice doctor, what's his name, St.
Look, why don't you do us both a favor and give up?
Won't you step off, Lou?
Why don't you come back tomorrow?
Hey, why don't you chew up this breakfast cereal ad for a change?
Hey, speaking of horseback riding, why don't you hop on and I'll race you to the finish?
Why don't you just go and work for your dad?
Why don't you take me to Sardis?
Why don't you ask your new girlfriend?
Why don't you come to bed?
Lady, why don't you let me worry about my baby and you worry about what your husband's watching?
Jeff, you're already working on 7 through 9, so why don't you just stick with those?
Why don't you stop by my studio sometime?
Why don't you go away and die?
Why don't you wrap that thing around your waist?
Why don't you just relax, enjoy the sun?
It's like, yeah, why don't you have your ex-wife move in with you?
Why don't you?
Why don't you try blasting Guns N' Roses into her machine until she can't bear it anymore and is forced to come out of hiding?
Why don't you come on and sit next to your auntie?
Well, then why don't you put them in the bag?
Why don't you step into my office and I'll tell you a bit about what we do here?
Why don't you guys go get ready?
Why don't you just sell it?
Melman, why don't you want to spend time with me today?
Okay, so why don't you tell me what happened to Ross junior year at Disneyland?
Honey, why don't you just take him out for ice cream like you used to?
Well, if you're having such a lousy time, then why don't you just leave?
Why don't you go find somebody to call?
Said, if you like it so much, why don't you wear it?
Why don't you tell me what this big idea about finding me a man is?
Why don't you go back to bed?
Why don't you stop them?
いかがでしたか？発音できるフレーズは聞き取ることもできるので、100回くらい声に出して練習しましょう。